Hey, good evening, everyone. It is just after 6 o'clock, so I'd like to go ahead and get started with tonight's presentation. My name is Rakia Nance, and on behalf of the Anne Arundel County Department of Public Works, I'd like to welcome you to tonight's presentation. I do want to note that tonight's presentation is being recorded, and further on in the presentation, we'll explain how you can access that recording as well as the presentation slides. Here are a few of the people that you'll be hearing from tonight. From the Department of Public Works, we have George Heiner, Ron Briggerman, Kiana Ray is also on the call. From HDR, in addition to myself, we have Ed Shea and Megan Robinson. Helping us with some of the technical aspects of recording tonight's session is Jake Scarano, who is also with HDR. Tonight's meeting is being hosted on Zoom, and here's an overview of the functions and features that are available to you. We're going to ask that you please mute yourself if you're not speaking, and to ensure optimal bandwidth, please leave your cameras off. We have quite a bit of information to present to you tonight, and we'll be stopping at a few points along the way to address questions. If you do have a question, feel free to enter that in the chat, and we will address them in the order in which they're received. If you feel more comfortable speaking your question, you can also use the raise hand feature to do that, and we'll call on you in the order in which the questions are received. Here's a bit of background about the purpose of tonight's meeting. We've gotten some interest from the community in the Septic to Sewer Connection program. So we've put together this informational meeting to share more information with you about that. This meeting is non-binding, so we're not asking you to make any decisions or vote on anything tonight. Instead, this meeting is designed to help you learn more, to make an informed decision on whether connecting to public sewer is right for you and your community. It is a community decision whether to connect to public sewer, and later on in the presentation, we'll explain more about how the community will be working together to decide if they'd like to move forward in the process. Again, please note that we're not here to obtain a commitment. We're just seeking input and interest. We're also not here to advocate for the program one way or the other. Again, this is ultimately a community decision. I also do want to highlight that none of what we're discussing tonight is confirmed. Everything is purely conceptual, and this is the very beginning of the process. And again, we'll explain later on in the presentation a bit more about that process and how you as a community will be working together to decide if you would like to move forward. Here's an overview of the information we'll be discussing tonight. First, we'll talk a bit about the Our Water program as it relates to Hollyanna Acres. Then we'll discuss funding and costs, followed by the application and petition process. Then we'll talk about next steps and open things up for extended Q&A. And with that, I'll turn things over to George Heiner from the Department of Public Works to give some background on the Our Water program. George? George, we're not able to hear you.
Still a no, George.
Or Kia, I can jump in and keep things moving while George figures out his audio.
Okay.
Hey, good evening. This is Ed Shea. I'm on the program team to support the septic to sewer. We're going to talk about how this community and the septic conversion program, it's an integrated program to reach water quality goals. This relates to the Chesapeake Bay TMDL that the county is meeting through a variety of strategies. It's a long-term effort, and this is one piece of it that we've identified that's very important. On the next slide, you can see an overview of the different elements of this program. There's 5 initiatives that the county is undertaking. Septic to sewer connections is part of that. There's also small system upgrades, small wastewater treatment systems that can be upgraded to improve performance and reduce nitrogen pollution to the bay. There's also stormwater improvements. That's a very big part of it. Reducing runoff or improving the water quality of runoff to reduce nitrogen. Also groundwater resiliency, looking long-term at the county's water supply, which is coming from groundwater wells. And finally, wastewater treatment enhancements, which the county has invested a tremendous amount in over the past decade or so to upgrade its major wastewater treatment plants and reduce nitrogen pollution coming from wastewater effluent.
Ed, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry about that. I don't know what happened. Okay, I'll take over now.
Great.
Were you just finishing this slide on the 5
Yeah.
program elements?
Yeah,
Did
we're
you
ready
talk
to change to the next one.
Okay, thank you. Apologize, everybody. I somehow I don't know what happened actually. So. Okay, so why is the county interested overall in seeing septic systems connected? So the main reason is because traditional septic systems are not as effective, particularly in removing nitrogen compared with our treatment plants. And so in most cases, the county's facilities remove more than 90% of the pollution compared with septic tank effluent. There is treatment that goes on in your soil after it leaves your drain field pipes, but how much happens is very dependent on a lot of the soil, the conditions in and around, your drain field. So the 90% here is really a comparison of our treatment plant effluent versus a typical septic tank effluent. Regardless of how well the soil does in treating a lot of the parameters, there's not much that goes on with respect to nitrogen removal in a typical drain field system or a typical soil area. So we're really looking at, in terms of improvements, are reductions in nitrogen pollution. Can you go to the next slide? So overall, we have 40,000 septic systems in Anne Arundel County. There's 13,000 in the critical area, which is areas that are within 1,000 feet of a tidal waterway. Septic systems are estimated to be a significant source of nitrogen in the county, and they, in addition to impacting the Chesapeake Bay, they have an impact on your local waterways. Can you go to the next slide? So what are some of the benefits overall for a septic system connections? There's, for the broader public, there's less nitrogen discharge to the Chesapeake Bay. This is in turn going to help us maintain compliance with the state requirements for what's known as the total maximum daily load. There's also going to be fewer nutrients and other pollutants in the local waterways. And one thing that I think not everybody realizes is that all the county waterways and watersheds are listed as impaired for nutrients and other pollutants. Can you go to the next slide? There are also some possible benefits for individual homeowners. So these are very site specific and may or may not apply to your situation. In a lot of cases, the size of your septic tank is connected to the size of the house, and so there can be restrictions on what you could do with the building addition based on your septic system. Also, your septic system has to have drain field space, whether that's in front of your house or behind your house, and there's usually the main drain field and a spare, and that limits what you can do with some of your property. There can also, in some cases, be a positive impact in home value when you're connected to the public system. Um, Again, this is very site specific, so if that's something that is of interest to you, we would suggest that you can consult a realtor about that. Could you go to the next slide? There's also some benefits. Other benefits for the homeowner is that in some areas, if you're on a private well, I think a lot of this community is on public water. If you're on a private well, there's always a setback between your well system and your septic system. So if you're on a septic system, that can eliminate that potential source of cross-contamination. As I mentioned earlier, it improves the overall local waterways. And then there are some costs that you avoid as a septic system owner. And we have these on a few slides. So the main cost that you take on as that you have as a septic system owner is the pump out cost, which is every couple of years. It's a few $100s every couple of years. And then another potential cost is a drain field replacement. Those can be fairly costly when they're needed. Also, that's for traditional septic systems. For best available technology systems, which are also known as nitrogen reducing units. These septic systems have been designed specifically to remove nitrogen. They have a bit more mechanical and electrical components, so they cost more for operations and maintenance. And then there's also the potential drain field replacement. So there are some costs that are avoided when you make a connection. Can you go to the next slide? So we have an overall need to try to protect our waterways and improve water quality. We've developed this process, which we're going to be talking in more detail tonight, which is an extension of the petition process. And our goal with this program is to try to connect up to 6,000 septic systems over the next 30 years. So that's 6,000 out of the 40,000 throughout the county. Can we go to the next slide? So just a little bit of background on the septic to sewer connection program. We started many years ago with initial concept level planning. This was done in response to at the time, what was called the Phase 2 Watershed Implementation Plan for the Chesapeake Bay. And that was really looking at significant nitrogen reduction loads in Anne Arundel County within the septic system sector, looking at lowering loads by almost 50%. We did a lot of planning at that time, sort of oriented around the idea that we might have to hook up 20,000 septic systems. And so some of the layout information we'll talk a little bit about tonight was developed at that time. We then initiated a septic task force. This was a collection of private citizens representing the business community, environmental community, and some actual community groups. They helped us develop input on policies, prioritization criteria, and outreach suggestions. And their contributions also led to legislation that was passed at the end of last year and early this year that we're going to be talking about in more detail tonight. The key ones are DPW is allowed to offer subsidies to projects in certain areas, and there can also be partial deferments of the annual assessment. We're going to talk in a lot more detail about those. And along with those legislative changes, we've developed a program to kind of help us evaluate and compare different communities, since we wouldn't be able to offer subsidy to all possible locations at the same time. So let's go with the next slide. So I mentioned eligible areas or certain areas. So eligible areas for the program features we're going to talk about tonight are in blue on this map. So the green is all of the planned sewer service area within the county. And the blue is the areas that are eligible for the subsidies and the deferments. And this area, Hollyanna Acres, is eligible because it is one that we had developed a layout for in the past when we did that initial planning. Okay, so this is the general area that we're looking at. As I mentioned, we'd done layouts some time ago in terms of looking at different potential areas that could be connected. And that's the polygons that we're showing here. So these designations 3MA059, those are just the designations we had when we did these layouts. It does seem so at the time when we first looked at this area had less sewer than it does now. So there have been a few areas where public sewer have been extended in this area. So it's really what we're showing here is actually kind of two separate sub drainage areas. The main sewer line is off to the east or to the northeast, and so that's really where we'd be looking to eventually flow. There has been public sewer put in basically from the elementary school over towards Mill Creek, and so that line has been installed, and so this would be areas that would kind of connect into those lines where it would be appropriate. There are a few vacant lots in the area, and as we'll get into in more detail, vacant lots are not eligible for the subsidies and deferments that are being talked about. And with that, I'm going to pause for questions. I apologize for the audio problem at the beginning. The next section we're going to talk about is funding and how the program costs are determined and how the assessments work. Okay, so I'm going to hand it off to Ed. You already met Ed. He's with HDR. He was gracious enough to step in for me for a little while. So go ahead, Ed.
Thanks, George. So the county has developed this new program to reduce the costs. And there are three basic cost elements that are illustrated here. And looking at the pie chart and also this graphic, the project cost to construct the local sewers is the biggest part. So that's the dark blue in the pie chart. And this is the sewer that would be installed in the right-of-way or in the street. The on-site costs are the private component, and that is represented by the cost to abandon your septic system and to construct a new pipe to convey the flow out to the trunk sewer. And then finally, the CFCC, or the Capital Facility Connection Charge, is representing the county's investment in the wastewater reclamation facility capacity to treat your wastewater. And that's a fixed charge that's currently about $9,000 paid at the beginning of when the sewer is connected. So in the next slide, we take a closer look of what's involved. The septic tank can remain in place. So we're saying abandon it, but not removing it. And the waste is hauled away by a licensed contractor or licensed liquid waste hauler. The new connection, the new sewer connection goes out to the street. There's typically a clean out installed at the property line that allows for maintenance of that sewer lateral. And the other element to this, the drain field, which would be on the left side there coming out from your septic system, that could remain in place as well. If you're planning on constructing anything on your property, elements of that system might be removed, but basically we're just looking at abandoning the septic system in place and connecting the new sewer. So typical costs for the public part of this, the public sewer constructed in the street, per household or per EDU, equivalent dwelling unit. Pollyanna tends to fall in the middle of what we're projecting for communities where septic to sewer is potentially going to be constructed, $50,000 to $60,000. And this relates to average property size, so the distance between homes that would extend the sewer, the proximity to the existing infrastructure that this would connect to, the depth of the sewer, whether we have grinder pumps, and we'll talk about that in further detail, how many pump stations we would have, any surface restoration. So if it's being constructed in the street, typically you would pave over the trench where the sewer is installed. And all that factors into the public cost. This is a project for the county. The project is managed and paid for by the county, and then the county recoups the cost through an annual assessment to the homeowners. So this next slide summarizes the private on-site costs that the county has seen historically. There have been homeowners who have connected. Usually that's been for homeowners who have a public sewer already in front of their house. And these costs have ranged typically between $2,000 to $8,000, sometimes up to $10,000. And again, that relates to property sizes. So how far is the distance to connect from where the septic tank is now out to the street where the sewer is being constructed? Topography of your property, if it's hilly, how much on-site restoration might have to occur if you're going through a driveway, that all factors in. But typically we're seeing those costs less than $10,000 for the private on-site costs. And we'll pause here for questions. I'll just add that those private costs are managed by the homeowner who would hire a master plumber to perform the work. Do we have any questions in the chat? I don't see any yet.
No questions in the chat.
Okay, so we'll look at this summary here for potential funding sources. The county subsidy, this was initiated by the septic task force through some legislation that was passed in the last year to allow for a subsidy of a percentage of project costs. So again, this is the public side cost to construct the sewer in the street, the biggest part of the project costs. And up to 25% of that can be covered by this county subsidy. The state has a Bay Restoration Fund grant program, and homeowners are already paying into this fund, and it's available for projects exactly like this. Grants can be used to offset on-site costs or the CFCC. So those two major homeowner costs can be covered with this BRF grant. And we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. The remainder of costs are passed to the homeowner through the annual assessment. So that's the annual assessment that allows the county to recoup its costs, its project costs. And the county takes advantage of low interest state loans to reduce the finance costs attributed to that assessment. So the project subsidy that we mentioned, the county's project subsidy, for income less than $300,000 a year for household, those homeowners are eligible for up to 25% of the per property project cost. So that's the full subsidy. For homeowners or households with income greater than $300,000, it's a half subsidy. So it's 12.5% available, 12.5% of the project cost. And the subsidy is used to reduce the annual assessment. So this is a new feature. This was not available before with the previous petition project, but this is intended to make connection to the public sewer more affordable. a few more words about the Bay Restoration Fund grant program. So again, the private on-site costs, which is the cost to you to abandon your septic tank and build the new sewer connection out to the street, plus the CFCC, that's the $9,000 plus or minus charge. I don't have the exact number, but that's currently around $9,000. Both of those elements of the cost can be funded with the BRF grant. The grant is currently allowing up to $20,000 per connection. And the intent is that only about 15,000 of that would be needed to cover the upfront costs. The other 5,000 remaining could be used to pay down the assessment. The funding is administered through the health department. So after you build your connection, that reimbursement or that grant funding payment goes directly to the contractor to reimburse them for the work after the connection is made. And for the construction cost, the project costs that are rolled up to the assessment, this is how it's built up. The construction cost is determined from an engineering study and eventually goes to bid by the contractor. That cost plus the engineering costs, easements, any acquisitions that need to be paid for to host, for example, a pump station that is going to be built, construction inspections, other overhead, all of those project costs get rolled into a net assessable amount. And any county subsidy or state grant is subtracted from that amount. It's financed over a 40-year period, and that's what's built into the assessment. Then it's spread over the number of properties that are in the project area. So previously, this was a 30-year term to finance the assessment. With the recent legislation, it's been extended to a 40-year term in an effort to make those costs a little bit more palatable. The assessment basis, again, households with income up to $300,000 can get the full subsidy. Also have eligibility to defer up to 50% of those costs. And so that's whether you're a household with less than 300,000 or more than 300,000, you're eligible to defer those costs up to 50% of the costs. For elderly and low income or permanently disabled, you're eligible to defer 100% of the costs. And again, we talked about that 15,000 of the BRF grant that's available for the on-site costs. Only half of that would be available for households with greater than $300,000 a year income. Vacant lots do not receive a subsidy or eligibility to defer costs, and they're also not eligible to receive BRF grant funding. So all of this amounts to an annual cost. The assessments are billed in January, typically. It's separate from your tax bill. And depending on which scenario you fall under, if you're just accepting the subsidy and not deferring any costs, or if you're 100% deferment, you fall into these bars with the blue and the green. So somebody who's not deferring any costs and has less than $300,000 household income would be that bar on the left. Costs would typically range between $1,500 and about $2,400 annually. This cost includes the sewer usage charge that you'd expect to see. This is an average amount that, depending on your usage, might be around $35 per month. So that adds up to about $420 per year on average. So that's factored into these cost ranges. Someone who chooses to defer 50% of the costs might range between $1,000 and about $1,450 per year. And then you can see that blue bar to the right, somebody who's eligible to defer 100% of costs. They're only paying for the sewer usage charges And so that's about $420 per year. So one final way to look at this in summary before I hand it off to Ron, we are going to go through the deferment example in a little bit more detail so you can understand that. But the private side costs are due upon connection, 100% due upon connection. But we do have the Bay Restoration Fund grants that are going to cover most of those for most homeowners. The capital facility charge also is due upon connection, can be covered by the Bay Restoration Fund grants, and can be financed over the 40 years, just like the assessment. And finally, the assessment has that option to defer up to 50% of cost, the balance being due upon sale of the home or at the end of 40 years.
Hey, Ed, we had a question about whether everyone has to use the same plumber for the private side work. And so I just wanted to answer that quick. So each individual homeowner is responsible for working with a plumber on their own property for the private side work. Okay, and I think Ron is up next to talk about the deferments and how the payment works.
Good evening, folks. Ron Briggerman with the Department of Public Works. I work in the Financial Services Division. Wanted to talk to you about the deferment options. Of course, deferring is just putting off payment, or at least a portion of the payment, to a later date. We have two different types. The first one is the partial deferral repayment, which is available to anybody in the project area. So once a project area was established, anyone in that project area can partially defer repayment. The deferred portion, so you take a look at the assessment, and the deferred portion becomes payable at the time of deed transfer, so the sale of your home, or 40 years, after 40 years, whichever happens first. So in the example, we have an estimated $60,000 40-year assessment. So without deferral, you would pay $1,500 a year, and after 40 years, it would be paid in full. If you deferred up to that 50%, you're deferring $30,000. So you would pay $750 a year because you're paying half of the assessment because you deferred half till later. So when you transfer the property or sell your property, whether it's after 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, whatever period of years, you owe $30,000. So if you chose this partial deferral and 1 year later something happens that you want to move and you have a great opportunity elsewhere, then you owe $30,000 and you would have paid $750 for that year. So you have to really take a look at it and make sure that deferring is the best option for you. Again, in the partial, you're saving $750 a year, but you are, taking a chance that if you sell your property earlier rather than later, that you have to pay $30,000, which even at $1,500 a year wouldn't occur until you wouldn't have paid that much until 20 years later. So if we go into the next slide, we have the full deferral repayment. Now this one, unlike the partial where everyone is eligible for that, this is only for qualifying owners. What qualifies you is you have to be considered totally disabled. There's definitions in the code as to what that means. Or you have to be 60 years of age or older, which they define as elderly, 60 years of age or older, and have limited income, which is also spelled out as to what income limits apply. So if you are eligible for that, you can defer 100% of the payment. And so assuming that same example of $60,000, each year that passes, $1,500 is set aside, and then the yearly assessment that you're paying is zero because each year that $1,500 gets put aside. When you transfer the property, for every year deferred, it's $1,500. 10 years would be $15,000. Continuing yearly assessment for the next owner is $1,500 a year. On the partial one, I didn't say it, but the last point was that the continuing assessment for the next owner would be $750 because you deferred up, the half, one half. So now if we look at the comparison on the next slide, we have that 40-year assessment, $60,000. If no deferral, we talked about it, $1,500 a year times 40 is $60,000. The year the house is sold, so we're looking at different periods of when you may transfer your home. So after 5 years, under the 5, 10, 15, or 20, under the partial deferment, when you transfer that home, you see each time period you're paying $30,000. Plus, you would have been paying $750 a month for each of those. A year for each of those years. $750 a year for each of those years. Then if you look at the 100% elderly/disabled deferment, and low income is with the elderly or over 60. At the end of 5 years, you're going to pay 5 times 1,500 is 7,500. At 10, 15,000. 20, you're going to pay that 30,000. So all of that is set aside until you transfer your home, and you see the payments there. Again, you have to really take a look at these and see what works best for you. And if you're eligible for the 100% deferment, how that can help you so you don't have to pay anything as you go under that 100% deferral, and you only pay when you transfer. So if there are any questions about that, I'll be happy to answer them. But we can go on to the next slide. I believe maybe George is taking over next, or maybe Ed.
Nope, it's me.
It's you, George. All right.
Yep. Okay, thanks, Ron. So
Yes, sir.
if we don't have questions on that section, we'll go to the application and the petition process. So all of the major changes tonight that we're talking about, the deferment and the subsidy, is these are actually changes to the existing sewer petition process. So in the petition process, residents send a petition to DPW and request a service, wastewater service, or it could be water service, to be extended to their location. And those projects are supposed to be self-sufficient financially, and that's why the residents pay the county back for that. The exception has been made for the sewer extensions because of the broader environmental benefits that come along with that. So in order to try to compare different potential projects, we developed an application process. And so in the overall process, the application process precedes the petition process. And so this overview here just kind of shows how they go together. So we're really at the very beginning, step one, where there's been some interest in the community. And so we're coming out, we're doing a presentation. We've done a number of these all throughout the county this year to let people know about the program. If there's an interest, we would look for an application to be submitted, and we'll talk a little bit more about what an application looks like in a few more minutes. DPW would do an additional concept level evaluation and come back for a second informational meeting. We'll have some updated information at that time and review a lot of the same material that we went over this evening. And then the next step would be for a neighborhood or a community to decide to send in the formal petition. And at that point, there is a form forms that are sent out. There's a map area that defines a project area under consideration. And people will have an option to say they're interested in the petition or they're against the petition. If the majority is in favor of it, at least initiating the petition, it would come to our group in utility design, and we would do what's known as a schematic design report or a preliminary engineering study. We then go back to have a public hearing, and we'll go over the expected costs and what we think the assessment will be. Then the ballots are sent out, and the community votes on whether they want to proceed. And this is the formal and kind of it's not kind of, it's formal and the binding step of the petition process. If the majority vote in favor of the petition, and the majority is 50% plus one vote, then the project will move ahead through the final design and construction. And then the community would be connected. One important thing to note is that it's a simple majority. So the 51% can make the 49% connect. So it's good to be talking to your neighbors and throughout your neighborhood to understand how people are feeling about it. If we go to the next slide, this is a little more detail on just the petition process. This is actually the same steps if you filed a water system petition. It would be the same steps. The community files the petition. With DBW, we do a preliminary engineering study. Again, that's sometimes called the schematic design report. We develop an estimate for the construction cost as we understand it, and some of the other project costs that we talked about earlier in the slides. At that point, we have a public hearing. We'll go over all of that. Ron and his group will be back to talk about what we think the assessment will be. And again, ballots will be sent out. If you do not respond to the ballot, that's taken as a no. So you need to affirmatively say, yes, you support the ballot and therefore you support the petition. Could you go to the next slide? If the majority are in favor, the DPW moves to the final design. So we are doing our plans and specifications at that point. We put the project out for advertisement, so it would be a publicly bid construction project. We hire the contractor, the work is performed. When the work is done, the residents will get a letter that says the work is complete and it's ready for connection. At that time, all the residents in the area have to connect, and they will have 9 months to make that connection. There are some exceptions. If you have recently installed a septic system or a nitrogen removal septic system, there can be an extension on the connection requirement, but the assessment would still be applied to the property, even if you had an extension on the connection timing. One other thing I should probably mention is the ballots that are presented are based on our expectation of the project costs and the assessment at that time. The final assessment, which begins the next calendar year after the work is completed, that final assessment is based on the final project cost. Sorry, you can go to the next slide now. So do we have any questions on the petition process at all? I don't know if this area has petitioned for water. I know there's some public water through the area, but I don't know if that was a result of the petition, a petition. Okay, if we don't have any questions, then let's go to the next section, which is.
There is one question.
Okay.
Resident asked, did a neighbor ask for this?
Well, my understanding is we did get some interest from people in this area through the ourwater.org website. And so what we've been doing when we have some interest in some areas is coming out and talking to people about the program changes, and so that they can understand how the petition process works and get some idea of what the costs might be. Okay. So let's move on to the next slide. So we have set up a web page within the ourwater.org website. We set up a web page for this area, and this you can get to it directly from the link that's shown here, or if you go to the Our Water website, you go to the septic to sewer drop down and you type in your address, and you should get a message that says you're in an eligible area, and a little blue box on the right hand side to click to this web page. On this page, we're going to post the slides from tonight's meeting, and in about a week, we'll post a recording of the meeting. We'll also post some other information if there's supplemental information we think we should be putting on here. There's also on this web page, there's a spot where you can indicate whether you're interested or you're not interested based on the information that's been presented. And there's a spot where you can leave some comments as well. As I mentioned, we've been doing a number of these presentations, so we're always interested in getting some constructive feedback on the material that's presented. So could you go to the next slide? So just quickly about the application process. So we mentioned that the next step would be to turn in an application, and in that it's not particularly rigorous, but we need a community name, a contact person, somebody we can talk to about the potential project, a project area map, but we can work with the contact person about that, and some initial show of community support. There's a couple different options that are listed here. I think in most cases, what we've been suggesting is that people can just let us know on the web page whether they're interested or not, and then if we're contacted about turning in an application, that gives us a way to look at that web page feedback and see whether others in the neighborhood appear to be interested or not. In this particular case, since there's existing public sewer kind of in the middle between the two drainage areas we defined, it would probably look a little bit more like two separate applications. But we could talk about that if there was some interest. And could you go to the next slide? So when we get the applications, we've developed a ranking system to compare potential projects. And this is just a way for us to look at different possible projects in comparison with each other's and some of our priorities. So on here, you can see how the scoring system is set up. So the number of pounds of nitrogen removed, whether a property is in the critical area, whether it's in an on-site wastewater management problem area. Those are all kind of high priority factors. And then other cost metrics are also part of the ranking system. So the intent here was that since we would not really be able to offer a subsidy to all potential locations, the applications would help us compare locations, and the applications will be valid for several years so that hopefully we could come back to a community if they were interested in 1 year and didn't receive a subsidy offer, that maybe we could come back to them in a subsequent year. Okay, so that is all of our formal presentation tonight. I appreciate everybody sticking with us. I see we have a couple of questions, so our team will stay on for a while until we've answered everybody's questions. But thanks for joining us. So let's see. The first one was: will there be a contract type of document that assures the prices at the end? I think the question is, will the cost of the assessment change over time? And so the answer to that is no. So the assessment is based on what our project costs are at the completion of the project. And that includes the financing that goes into that. So Ron, you can correct me if I get off track, but what we do is
You've
we look
got
at the
it.
project cost, the financing cost. We say, okay, that's the total project cost at the end of it, and then that's divided up by the number of properties, and then that's divided up over 40 years. And then so that number doesn't change after it's
And
starts.
one other thing, George, if I may, is
Sure.
that when the assessment is calculated, it's based on not only the cost of it costs to construct and do all the other things that George and Ed mentioned previously, but also the county has to finance the project. So there's a reimbursement. All the projects have to be self-sustaining, meaning they have to pay for themselves. The county doesn't make any money on these, but we need to collect all the money back that is invested. Part of that investment, of course, is all that interest that is incurred by the county. So it's not interest you are paying, you're not being charged interest. It's you're repaying the county, reimbursing the county for the interest in all of their expenses. So that interest obviously is a huge component when you're talking about high dollar projects. That's all I had, George.
So I think there's a question about it's difficult to make a decision if you don't know what your on-site costs are. If I'm paraphrasing it a little bit. Um, it's so we can't really, because the on-site costs are very site specific, we really can't provide an estimate on that. If what we did show earlier, and maybe Rakia, can you go back to that slide? It's
Sure.
number 23.
Okay.
So what we're showing on this slide is the actual historical costs that other people have had on their property. Okay, there it is. So you can see there's really for most locations, it's between this 3,000, to 6,000 range. There are people though, and this isn't the majority, but it's a significant number that do have these larger costs. So if your house, the features that really are seen somewhat common in having those higher on-site costs are that your house is far away from the lot, or perhaps it's down slope from the main road, or the way the piping around your house is configured can be difficult. So this is really the best we can offer. But if you have those sort of things, like also significant property driveway restoration, sometimes there's landscaping things that need to be done. So you could be on the right side of this diagram, so to speak.
George, the only thing I'd add there is, of course, as you see on that chart, the bars there, if it's still up there, yeah, there it is. So if you look all the way over to the right, you're at greater than $20,000. Most of those bars are going to be covered by the Bay Restoration Fund grant program. Their funding, like George said, if your income is determinative around 300,000, but if you have less than that in terms of household income, you're going to get $15,000. That's going to cover most of the bars in that chart right there. So, just something to think about, that yes, it's hard to determine what it will be, but a lot of it is going to be covered by Bay Restoration Grant funding. So that's something to
I guess,
consider as well.
yeah, I guess the other thing I'd just add is we're not asking anybody to make any kind of decision on anything right now. As Rakia mentioned, this is an informational meeting, and it's really just to help people understand how the petition process works and some of the incentives that we've tried to create to make it more affordable for sewer connections. So, it's certain something to think about if you're interested, and we understand it's not the right fit for all communities. Um, and that's certainly fine. So, okay. Well, if we don't have any other questions, I appreciate everyone's time. I know we presented a lot of information, um, but thanks for sticking with us, and have a nice evening.
Yes, thank you all.